Welcome to Fiscal Note CQ Roll Call's latest webinar, and today we're talking about advocacy as a key member benefit. And we can tell that a lot of you are very interested in this topic. We've had an almost record-breaking number of folks register for today's webinar. So I'm not going to waste too much time introducing myself and getting started, but I am Anne Dermody. I'm the Content Marketing Director here at CQ and Fiscal Note. Delighted you could join us today, and just a little bit about us and specifically about our advocacy offerings. We have combined the power of Fiscal Note and CQ to bring you a lot of advocacy offerings. Our main flagship one being our Voter Voice platform, which is a very robust digital advocacy platform. We also have CQ Engage, which is another big, robust platform for digital advocacy, and we have CQ Ignite. CQ-nologist is our congressional directory for folks who need to establish relationships on the Hill. CQ Advocate Acquisition is our digital advocacy advertising tool. And finally, CQ Converge is our Hill Day app or our event app. So if anyone's interested in any of those products, obviously feel free to reach out. I'd also ask for, from a little kind of housekeeping perspective, if you do have questions, because we have 3 panelists today and they're all on the line, we will keep the questions until the end. So if you have questions throughout, please enter them in the chat box. And now let's introduce our great panelists. And I'm particularly excited today because we really have some serious experts in the house. So let's start with Joshua Habursky. Josh is the head of Federal Affairs at IPCPR, which is the International Premium Cigar and Pipe Retailers. He's the founder and chairman of the Grassroots Professional Network, which is a nonprofit organization of 25,000 advocacy professionals. He's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. And he's got a lot of experience in the advocacy space, which I'm sure he'll incorporate into his presentation today. We'll follow Josh with Dr. David Rehr, who is a professor and director at the Center for Business Civic Engagement at the Schar School of Policy and Government in George Mason University. He's the former CEO of the National Association of Broadcasters and the National Beer Wholesalers Association, so lots of really in-depth and great business experience there too. And then finally, we have Sharon Bonnet, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and that is the largest adult education association in the world, with 55,000 educators who provide services to 1.5 million adult learners nationwide. So really, as you can tell, 3 great panelists today who know more than a thing or two about making advocacy a key member benefit. So let's kick off with Josh, and over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Anne. Very excited to be joined for this webinar with Dr. Rehr and Sharon. Dr. Rehr and I actually have been at this for a couple of years, exploring different ways to talk about associations and advocacy and government relations in general. And I think it may have been last year already, or at least a couple months ago, we did a webinar for this series on justifying government relations, and that was more justifying your existence for government relations with an internal board or the internal stakeholders within your organization. And I would really recommend any of you that are listening into this webinar to go back to that one on Fiscal Notes page and take a look at that, because paired together, this gives you kind of the robust, holistic approach to not only justifying your existence internally, but externally to your members as well. We also did a follow-up and precursor piece on May 29th for campaigns and elections. Little bit different title, but how to get member buy-in for your group's advocacy program, and that's an article, and it has basically a summary of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So getting member buy-in and fostering engagement opportunities. And I think it all starts with the psychology of why do people join an association? Why do you get involved with an entity? And, boiled down simplistically, the networking opportunities to meet like-minded people within your trade or within your membership group to find people with common interests. Education, of course, the continuing education aspect of it, learning about your trade, learning some in-depth, seasoned techniques that are involved. And, of course, representation. And representation, looking at that from the advocacy government relations lens. But these opportunities and buy-in has to be tangible. It has to be direct. It has to be something that's in front of members of the association so they know exactly what they're getting. And I think the representation aspect and the advocacy aspect of that, especially at the federal level, when you're not necessarily located in D.C., it can be challenging to make that a tangible and direct benefit. And then, of course, making it quantifiable, and that's where a lot of times the grassroots and the metrics side of things come in. So connecting all those pieces together and not just making it a stat of how many meetings your contract lobbyist or your in-house lobbyist did on the Hill. Combining all of those parts together and showcasing how your advocacy program, how your government relations program fits within the overall association and the different ways where members can engage on all different fronts. Go to the next slide. So association dynamics, many of your associations that are on the phone today, you could be located or headquartered outside of D.C. If you are a large membership association or a trade association, you're either regionalized in a different state, you might have one person representing you in D.C., or, you're spread out like most associations across the country. Your focus could be elsewhere. Advocacy might be something that your organization is involved in, but not the main purpose of the existence of the organization. It may be one of those things where you certify people and provide credentials for your trade or your craft, and then you provide some basic advocacy. It might be an information sharing purpose as your primary purpose. And your members could have varying degrees of what I call DC knowledge, or that Washington knowledge of how does the federal government work, how does it connect with the states and localities. And they may only engage with the association, the overall association, on a limited basis. You might have certain members that only come to your trade show or your convention, or come to the organization when they are having a problem. Oh no, the federal agency came in and inspected my location. I know that I'm a member of the XYZ association. Let me contact them and see if they can help me with this problem, because I really don't know where to go or what to do. And that tends to be common. You might have your boards of directors or your highly engaged members, but the vast majority of people that pay that basic level dues might not be all that engaged in the overall association, and even more so, less engaged with the association when it comes to advocacy and federal advocacy. Next slide. So advocacy in the association. It is especially hard to quantify during gridlock and in times when there aren't being things passed consistently, or you don't see something in the news, every day that involves your specific trade or your membership. It's sometimes seen as a revenue drain. All of these people in Washington, D.C., they spend all of our hard, membership dollars, our association dollars, going around taking members of Congress for fundraisers and hosting these swanky events. Hollywood has a definite negative perception when it comes to lobbying and advocacy, and sometimes members outside of D.C. get swept up into that as well. It takes time and effort to communicate advocacy as having a true value. It's not something that's going to be overnight where all of a sudden your members are going to get it. They understand, all right, I get this. Advocacy is a key member benefit. You have to show them something, show them why value exists within the association and the advocacy functions. So generating revenue, there's a ton of different ways, through communications, advertising, live events, sponsorships, or even trade-offs with other departments where advocacy can actually make money for the organization. In a previous association that I worked with, we would host advocacy trainings for key grass tops members, talking about what was going on, the state of play when it came to Congress, how they might be able to engage, and we work with local sponsors saying, hey, we have 30 members that are able to come here. It's going to be a tight-packed presentation, 3-hour-long seminar. You will have significant opportunities to get in front of this group. They were C-suite folks, so definitely a curated list. But we were able to charge sponsorship for that and make money for the association rather than being a cost spending event or a revenue drain, as I mentioned. Next slide. So core ways to sell advocacy, and this really goes down, and the cheat sheet is in that article that I referenced. Establish a grassroots program. This might be the easiest thing, or it may sound like it is the easiest thing, but you wouldn't believe how many associations or how many corporations don't have a formal grassroots program. It's one of those things where, all right, maybe an issue comes up in Kansas or it comes up in Florida, and I'll get 3 or 4 people to weigh in on this and call their members of Congress that they know. But they don't have a formal year-long grassroots program. I think that's the first and the easiest step. Technology continues to advance on that front. Ann mentioned all the products that Fiscal Note has in the beginning. Those help in fostering that year-round advocacy program, along with professional staff being in it. Even if you are a federal, head of government relations or director of government relations, you can dabble in that grassroots function, even on a limited basis. And that's a way to demonstrate a vehicle where members can interact with your association, where they can weigh in and take part and be part of a movement, essentially. Generate a yearly advocacy annual report. We've talked about creating advocacy annual reports in past webinars. That's another thing that you can reference. This is an important step. This shows your membership. Here are the metrics. Here's everything that we're looking at. I have 3 versions of this that I use, one for executive leadership, one for internal staff, and one that's external for your average member, or if a media entity wants to pick it up. So, putting those 3 pieces together, you're able to target 3 different audiences, but again, demonstrating value across the board. Calculate the imposed costs or potential expense to the association membership for negative legislation or regulations. I'm not going to steal Dr. Rear's thunder. I know he has a ton of examples on this point here, but that's one core way to sell advocacy. And then another very simple one, actually define what advocacy is. There's misconceptions. People have different definitions of what advocacy actually entails. In any of the 4 associations that I've been part of, one of the first things that I do is create a one-pager. What is advocacy? How can you get involved? What's the value of it? Answer those 3 simple questions, and then whenever you get somebody coming to you, hey, I'm interested in getting involved, what can I do? Send the one-pager there. Everything's there. It's compact. It's neat, and people can process that fairly quickly. Association engagement generates more advocacy involvement. I think that this, if there was a way to quantify this or do a study, I would love to see this, but I truly believe this, and I've seen this anecdotally everywhere I've been. If people are, engaged with advocacy, they're more likely to join other parts and be involved in other parts of the organization and become universal champions. That might be a way to get somebody that sends point-click messages or signs a petition to eventually go up the ladders of engagement and write a PAC check or become involved as a co-chair of a committee or something like that. And then the other important point here when you're selling advocacy, constantly refresh. I see some organizations out there that have the same stuff that they created 5-7 years ago. You can use similar content and refresh that content, but repackaging, repurposing it is essential. You can't have the same stuff that's antiquated 7 years ago, even if it's on a secondary, tertiary page of a website. Continually build resources and build off the resources that you already have.
Great, thank you, Josh. Really good tips there and really good best practices, too, for anyone listening. So we're going to go over to David now. So if you want to take it away, David.
Well, thank you, Ann, and thank you, Josh, for making the comment a little bit about the upcoming presentation. I am an economist by background, so I think in terms of money. Why do people engage in organizations, join organizations, love organizations? It's because you're saving them dollars which flow to their bottom line and make their life better. Next slide. I found this statistic which was very interesting that we asked Americans in 2017, tell us about the 3 branches of government. And the greatest number, 33%, is that they didn't know any branches of government. And I think this makes a point that I've experienced over about 25 years, is that people are less engaged than we think they are when it comes to advocacy at all levels of government, particularly at the federal level. They may read about it, but they generally hate politicians, they hate legislators, they hate government, and they're just not really thinking about it like we are. Next slide. So why do people join associations? And Josh talked a little bit about this. 1, they do it because they want to network. 2, they want to gain new skills. 3, they want access to educational and professional resources. 4, they want jobs. And 5, they want community outreach. This is a study done in 2017. But the critical thing for all of us who are really into lobbying and advocacy is they're not even thinking about joining for advocacy. So you have to make them aware of the value in terms of dollars of what it means to be a member. Next slide. Americans generally pay 97 different taxes. And I thought this was a great way to kind of take a quiz with all of you on the phone. Well, because I started thinking about it at first. Well, I pay corporate tax, I pay individual tax. But when you start going through the list, there's building permit taxes, there's dog license fees, there's driver's license fees, there's environmental fees. I mean, there are loads of ways that the government obtains revenue for goods and services, and I'm not arguing about taxes, but I don't think people think about all the specifics, and that's my point. Next slide, please. And then there's the additional cost of government, new rules or changes in current rules, which they might not be aware of, and I would say that maybe bad on us as the business community, but we sometimes find some of our competitors, some of our industries, looking for ways to leverage competition over competitors by using the government for regulations or laws. A law gets passed and, oh, surprise, it helps my business but hurts your business. And I don't have to compete on products or goods or services. Next slide, Ann, I'm sorry. And I want to give you a couple of examples here. And I don't want to get into the politics of the minimum wage. I'm sure people deserve the minimum wage, but increasing the federal minimum wage. Basically you can quantify how much it's going to cost. And this is a fairly easy example. You take the $15 that people are saying we need. Our current minimum wage is $7.25, so that's $7.75 increase. You multiply 52 weeks by your number of employees, and if you have 30, it costs your business an average of $12,000, a little over $12,000 a year. And the reason I raised that is because when I started my career as an advocate for the NFIB, they were going through a minimum wage increase. Not everybody was aware we could defeat it, but they thought, oh, my God, I'm a small business person. I might gross $350,000 a year. That's gross. That's before all the bills are paid. And now suddenly I have to raise wages $12,000. Where am I going to get the money from? Oh, joining the NFIB only costs $200. I'm surely going to join because you're going to save me over $12,000 or $11,000 by doing this. Next slide. What do you have to do to demonstrate value? And I think a lot of us who are primarily engaged in politics, we come to Washington maybe working on campaigns, maybe we're into politics, and we're really not thinking as a business person would think, or someone who's actually not thinking about government helping or harming them would think. One, we have to educate our members on the importance of the particular issue that we're engaged in. Two, we have to price it as objectively as we can. Three, we have to advocate using historical tools. I'm sure everybody could do that. Four, we need to provide a conclusion to our members and emphasize how much we save them. And even sometimes when you lose, you win. And number five, we need to keep repeating the process over and over again to build the reputation of delivering value. You may not have a savings of $1,500 or $2,000 every year, but you do it a couple of years in a row, people are going to instinctively think that you're saving them money and not worry about it. So educating your members on the importance of the issue. Of course, we would use traditional PR communication strategies and skills. You might want to undertake a special communications on the issue, pull it out and say minimum wage. I'm going to get to one in just a second on ergonomics, which was very important for me when I was at the beer wholesalers. Here's the challenge. All of your PR people, other departments in your office are going to go, oh, we can't waste time talking about that. But you have to overcome their objections internally, and you have to make the point, this is real money. This makes a real difference to our members, and this is why we're here. Have the members tell their stories on the expense of the regulation or bill. I once did a newsletter where I had comments from members about the bill, which ironically got their friends who were also in the industry more engaged because they could see they were like, well, if this guy can do it, I can do it. Or if she can do it, I can certainly do it. And I thought that was really important. And many of you may be doing, I think the next kind of communications device to impacting Congress, I do research on how to communicate with Congress as well, is video. Congressional staff are real open to watching short and good video. Well, and it's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. As you engage in doing video to Congress, you can use the same video to educate your members. Next slide. So here's my favorite example. A while ago, OSHA wanted to have a new regulation called ergonomics, which was the science of lifting, instituted on all industry in the United States. And for the beer industry, all we do all day is lift. We lift six-packs, we lift cases, we lift kegs. Sometimes because of the places we go, 640,000 different retail outlets, you have to go in the basement, you have to go downstairs. If you're like in a big city like New York, it's difficult to get into the areas where they keep all the beer. So we hired an outside consulting firm to determine the impact. And they came back to me at the NBWA and said, we think this implementation of this, because it's so new and so significant to the industry, it's going to cost you $1 a case. So that was pretty easy to explain to beer distributors. You would ask the distributor, what's your volume? And they would say maybe 20 million cases. So we can go to the next slide for just a second, Ann. Oh, I'm sorry, go back one. On the click. Go backwards. Yeah. The point I want to make is when you see a distributor or you'd visit a distributor, you'd say, what's your volume? And they'd say 20 million. And you'd say, based on this study, this regulation, if it goes into law, is going to cost your company $20 million. Now, you either get that by reducing your profit, reducing your wages, trying to sell more, which is hard. We all know that. So you have to figure out a way. Be smart at what you do, which you're doing constantly, but that's a big nut, 20 million. So you're all engaged in trying to stop it or change it so it doesn't have that kind of negative impact on your business operation. Next slide. And then, of course, after you use the kind of objective tool of how much it's going to cost, you use your historical advocacy tools. Research, think tanks, meetings. I'll go from left to right here, but research, other members of Congress to vouch for your issue, personal meetings, third-party think tanks to support you, advertising, dropping billboards from your office building if that's possible. I know in D.C. it's about $1,200 a year to keep a billboard on your office if it's okay for the entire year, which I thought was a great deal. As Josh talked about, using grassroots, and I'm sure Shannon will raise it as well, and then using social media to get your word out. Other tools might include being on TV, working with the Republican Study Committee or the Democratic Study Committee, being on the radio. We're hearing more and more ads at D.C., having the Congressional Research Service do a research report or issue some report they've done already on what your issue is and how much it will help or hurt your industry, dealing with senators, and, of course, having the GAO doing an investigation, which leverages the government research for you, and having surveys being done. So provide a conclusion to your members and emphasize how much they save. In my life, I follow the rule of 7, that sometimes someone needs to hear something from you 7 times before they consider your marketing proposition. That is to say, if you go with a 1-off or a 2-off and say, we sent an email, most people don't open their email now. There's a lot of junk in the email systems that clogs it up. But you got to tell somebody clearly and simply 7 times why it's good for them or why it's bad for them. Otherwise, they don't get it. Next slide, please. And never build expectations or exaggerate. You'll all remember Dr. Evil from the Michael Moore, Austin Powers movie a few years ago. But it always caught me when somebody would say, I'd be at a coalition meeting with lobbyists. Somebody would say, this introduced bill will cost our business $1 billion. And their business is only worth maybe $50 million. I mean, it's like absurd. So you've got to be careful you don't fall into that absurdity. Even if you think it's going to cost a lot of money, you have to make it realistic for people to go, yeah, that sounds real to me. It doesn't sound not real. And a couple tips I might suggest is, number 1, don't become Dr. Evil from that famous thing when he wanted to blackmail the federal government $50 million. Everybody thought it was a big deal except for him. Or he thought it was a big deal, but no one else did. They all laughed. But keep your number reasonable, even if you have to underestimate, and bounce your calculations off another advocate to pass the smell test. Say, this just sounds reasonable to me. If it does, we'll go with the number, and we'll have a good reputational effects of how we got there. Thank you for your time. You need to remember a couple things. You need to work hard for your examples. You need to over-communicate to your members. And most importantly, as fabulous lobbyists, you all need to deliver. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me at this email address or call me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. And thank you for bringing it back to kind of the bottom line, too, because, of course, it's not just corporations or that need to, watch the figures and watch the numbers. We all have to kind of justify, the spend and justify why there's an economic value to advocacy as a key member benefit, too. So with that, I am going to go over to our last presenter, last but certainly not least. So Sharon, the CEO of the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and we're also happy to say is a client of ours here at Fiscal Note and CQ. So take it away, Sharon.
Great. Hello, everybody. So the Coalition on Adult Basic Education entered into a national public awareness campaign last year. And we did this because we were quite concerned about potential funding cuts from the Trump administration. Our funding is to the tune of a little over $649 million. And we had not seen an increase in many, many years. And so with the possibility of having 25% of our budget cut, so about $87 million that was potentially going to be cut, we really felt like now was the time to work with our 55,000 plus members to really rally them and stand united with this campaign. So next slide, please. The national campaign really spoke to the fact that we felt there was a lack of understanding and a diminished value of the work that we were doing. And in the field that I'm in, which is adult basic education, there's really a stigma around the work that we do in general. So that was also something that we were trying to address through this national campaign. Next slide, please. So the three campaign goals were that we wanted to create a process for concerted collective effort to reach local, state, and federal officials as well as general community. We also wanted to inform and educate officials and the general public about the relevancy of adult education. And we wanted to have specific asks to support our funding for adult education. Next slide, please. We did this through creating a campaign toolkit. So we have fact sheets, postcards, and rally signs. We created an award-winning video. We also created sample proclamations and state mobilization kits. Next slide, please. So we really had a very specific approach in that we utilized knowledgists for the grass top approach, and we also had in-person meetings with legislators. So for those of you that aren't familiar with knowledgists, this is where we can send messages directly from our organization to legislators. So we have prepared talking points that we send every 2 weeks out to legislators, and includes graphics. And the really nice thing about knowledgists is that you can send to legislative staff, or you can send to appropriators. You can really cull the list exactly how you'd like it to be, and that's been really, really helpful. We've actually gotten some great feedback from legislators on using this service. Then we also utilized Ignite CQ roll call for our grassroots approach, and this is where we would have customized text and letters that our members could use. So they could pick up the phone and call, and we could track it through there, or they could also send an email to their legislators, and we could track it that way. And then we also send ongoing alerts to our membership, and we showcase our successes. So we're constantly talking about the value of what we're doing, why it's important, what's going on with the federal landscape, and that keeps our members engaged. Next slide, please. We also have state and national partners, and we're constantly demonstrating the collective impact of working with our state partners, as well as, I should actually demonstrated on here that our national partners have been a big part of this as well. So we were really, really intentional about these partnerships. We went out to all of our state partners, so we have over 47 state partners, and all of our national partners, and combined there is 100 plus partners that were working with us on this campaign. Next slide, please. So what I'm really excited to share about is that this tool, the Ignite software, enabled us to have over 115,000 connections with legislators. We felt like this exceeded our expectations, and that this was the reason why we not only were able to stave off funding cuts, but also to add funding to that $649 million for the first time in 15 years. So this tool that we're talking about here, CQ roll call, really made a difference for us. Next slide, please. I took here just a quick little snapshot of our friends in Pennsylvania. So I mentioned that we partner with state associations. Our friends in Pennsylvania did their own little outreach around our Adult Ed and Family Literacy Week that we tracked through our tool. And we were able to see exactly how many adult learners reached out, how many connections were made at the local, state, and federal level, how many teachers had reached out. So there's some really amazing tracking and reporting features in this system. There was 174 total that took action, 1,293 connections, and 54 legislators that were contacted. And our state association loved this information, and so did our national board of directors. Next slide, please. Okay, you might just want to scroll through this real quickly, but what I was really excited about was that through this campaign, we were contacted by Success Files with Rob Lowe, and they put together a video and interstitial working with myself and our selected board members and an adult learner who had a really compelling story. And this went out to a projected 143 million viewers nationwide. The ad was played over 400 times on all major cable networks, and we had a 6-minute documentary on PBS as well as a 4-minute narrowcasted interstitial. And why we thought this was so exciting was because this didn't cost us anything, but came about because of the Educate and Elevate public awareness campaign. So really, as we were demonstrating success of this campaign, and partially by using Knowledgeus and Ignite software, this is where we were able to gain traction and get this free video put together by Success Files with Rob Lowe, where Rob Lowe actually did a piece in the beginning. This would normally cost so much, like millions of dollars, to be able to get out on PBS and be able to have this sort of a video done for us. So this was really a bonus to us as a result of this software that we're talking about here today. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I just really put together what this software has been able to do for us. So year one, we were able to save off $87 million in funding cuts and then add $30 million to the budget. Year two, we've had $30 additional million added. And year three, because it's the Trump administration, we're now fighting $156 million in funding cuts, but it looks like we'll be successful on that front as well. So you can see that through this tool, which gives us access, gives our members access to legislators, we're able to really have a wonderful collective impact. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to note that this software amplifies the voice of our membership, and it's a really simple and efficient tool. So if you have some sort of a burning need, for funding with legislators, I could not recommend it a better tool. This tool has been fantastic for us, and the staff there at Fiscal Note and CQ Roll are awesome. They are so easy to work with, and they just are extremely responsive. We were kind of hesitant as a nonprofit going into this. We weren't sure, would this be worth our money? Was this something we should invest in? And now we know not only was it well worth our money, but we are recommending it to as many people as we can because we know that you're able to really reach legislators this way. We also have had a number of those in our field who have reached out to legislators, come back and say, I've been contacting my legislator for years and never got a response until I used the software. So I just want to say, thank you to Fiscal Note, CQ Roll Call. It's an excellent product. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks so much, everyone.
Well, thank you, Sharon. And believe it or not, to anybody listening, we did not ask Sharon to give us all that praise, but we'll very happily take it, and we're delighted to hear that you're happy with the software. One thing I did notice from your presentation was you brought a lot of metrics in there, and obviously with the tool, that's something you can do, and it's a way to show that benefit not only internally, when we talked about justifying your existence earlier from the webinar we had done last year, but also externally, right? Because those are things that you can help to message out, right? When you've had those successes, you can pull those off of a dashboard and send those out to your members or your stakeholders, which also gives a bigger impact, I think. But I wanted to ask, well, let's start with you, Sharon. Because you are a coalition, your stakeholders presumably are a little bit different. Does that sort of change your messaging, and does that change sort of how you approach things? Or is that just the same as if you were a regular trade association, say?
Right. So our messaging is really broad in that we just tell them, get out to your legislator and let them know that adult education is important. We don't tell them, oh, you have to support a certain bill, but rather let them know adult ed matters. And that's been really helpful because by having that sort of a broad brush, all of the stakeholders could be involved and all of them could take action and push it out to their networks and bases. Okay, great. I think I will put this to Josh and maybe David as well. So one of the questions here is,
how do state government affairs programs at associations fit into this? You know, the examples were largely federally focused, so are there extra tips for ensuring that you're promoting advocacy from both a federal and a state policy perspective? And maybe we'll start with you, Josh, and then David, if you want to chime in too.
For sure, I think sometimes at the state level it can be even more challenging. A lot of people that are following politics or policy in any sense are looking at federal policy. So some of the things that really matter to state organizations are overlooked. So getting people their attention on the subject matter can be the first hurdle for people. But I think, selling the, advocacy as a key member benefit to them, a lot of it comes down to that initial hand-to-hand outreach, really just picking up the phone and calling and starting to cultivate those relationships with people. At the state level, it is on the other side, it's a little bit easier. It takes less people to move and get noticed by the state legislatures or even at the local level. So you might be able to find 5 people that have a vested interest in your issue, connect with them, take those half-hour phone calls, and if they're able to articulate that message to, a chairman on the state assembly, that might be enough to actually get that to work. And then build off those little wins. So once you get something through, or you're able to showcase to your membership, all right, we were successful at this, even if it's a local thing, build that up and say, all right, we were able to defeat this tax in New York City, which would cost $10 million. Well, at the state level, we're experiencing a very similar issue. This time we need you to not only take action, we need you to contact like-minded people, your friends and family, because this one will cost $100 million because it will affect our entire state. So, building off of the branches of government as well as the levels of government is a good, well-rounded way. And no matter where you sit, if you're just a local entity or a state entity or a federal entity, you can work on those contours and even build off one another to sell advocacy.
Okay.
That's a great answer, Josh. This is David. I would just add a couple things. Number one, your best friends are generally your longest friends. Most people in Washington start at the state level. So every investment you make at the state level generally yields you dividends when they come to D.C. and become a member of Congress or a senator or president or whatever they're doing, because they love politics and they're going to continually think about moving up. Secondly, the same process of quantifying legislation applies, so there's no difference there. Thirdly, what makes state government different than federal government, and the federal government, in my mind, is sometimes it tends to be less rules oriented, more personality based, which you have to figure into your strategy. But it's still very important to your members that they know that, the state of Illinois may be costing them an additional $1,000 a year or $800 a year or $50,000 a year, and it's not all Washington, because sometimes people are anxious just to blame Washington for everything when it's legitimately sometimes not their fault.
Okay. I'm going to direct this to you as well, David, and maybe Josh and maybe Sharon. I'm not sure if you want to chime in here, but how do you balance marketing your government affairs program with preventing your political adversaries from knowing your strategy or initiatives?
Well, right. Let me just give you some bullet points, I think in threes. But one, you don't need to reveal your strategy to cost out what it's going to mean to your membership. Right? Whether we fought ergonomics through the IRS or through Congress, we ended up using the Federal Review Act to stop it. But they never knew that we were going to do that. They just knew that it was very costly. Secondly, it cost $1 a case. Secondly, I think that you may want to think about your feinting a little bit in your strategy, so not everything is very obvious. sometimes we're so focused on just Congress, everybody goes, we'll go to Congress, we find out in Congress. But send a letter to the OMB requesting documentation on the cost, or to another federal agency, or get someone else engaged. You know that's not your real strategy. You're going to eventually go through Congress, but it misleads your opposition. And they might get a little confused by that. It might send a lot of their resources trying to fight you on a battlefield you don't really want to play on. And thirdly, I'm a big picture, all-in type of guy. If you're handling a different issue, a difficult issue, you may have to press all sides at the same time, which will make you exhausting, which will exhaust you, but will give you the greatest chance of victory, because you're not really sure where the weak points are in the strategy. I know this would be years ago when I was first involved as a lobbyist for the National Federation of Independent Business. We repealed a federal health care law, which I don't think has been done since then, but it became a crusade. And eventually members couldn't take the pressure of hearing from their local business people and how difficult it was for them, for their small businesses. And we got it passed through the House and the Senate, which was a great accomplishment. But literally no one in Washington thought it could happen, because the conventional wisdom was, at the time, Dan Rouse-Zinkowski was the chairman of the committee. He spoke against it at the press club. He was a pretty aggressive guy. You'll never get it done. Well, you just have to figure out how you work around him. And we got John LaFalce, who was a Democrat, who was the chairman of the Small Business Committee, take the lead, and he was successful.
Okay. Did Josh or Sharon want to say anything there?
Just to add a little bit, I in today's political environment, in today's media landscape, I assume that most of the stuff that we're working on could become public. It could be out there in a headline at some point. So for the most part, I try to be as transparent as possible when it comes to the strategy and how things are operating. Obviously you have things that are confidential if you're working in coalitions, but for your key stakeholders, your board members, the people that are continuously engaged in your organization, they know most of the playbook that we're working on, because they're the ones that are actually, implementing and playing on the field as we're calling the plays, and providing feedback on that. So, I definitely go a little bit further than most programs in marketing what's going on. The biggest thing that I want to showcase in selling advocacy, and I'm selling it to several different sectors, our membership is the most important. They need to see the value of what our advocacy is doing for their membership dues and for their participation. But secondarily, I want to market our government affairs program out there within Washington, because it's very competitive. If you're not on the menu, you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And, so in that competitive environment, I want everyone to know within Washington, D.C. that we exist as a robust government affairs program. And I don't care if they know some of the strategy, because we're going to implement that strategy whether they like it or not.
Okay.
And
Sharon,
this is David.
Okay.
Let me just add one more thing, which is pretty timely. So the National Association of Business Political Action Committees, which is a association group fighting campaign finance reform that prejudice against corporations, had a meeting in Palm Beach where they revealed their 54-slide strategy for the next Congress, which included naming reporters they wanted to influence, some of whom worked for Congressional Quarterly. And somebody took that platform and gave it to the Huffington Post. And if you, after this seminar, type in NABPAC Huffington Post, you can see the complete strategy for their effort for the entire next 2 years of the Congress. Big mistake. Don't be so obvious about what you're doing. Plus, in the case of these reporters, when you're naming people by name, which was a mistake in and of itself, you've got to be really careful, because they feel used if they're part of some big strategy to convince them that corporate PACs are okay.
Yeah, fair point. So, Sharon, I'm going to direct this one to you. What do you do when the group has been working on the same issue for a few years and the members have started to burn out on the advocacy?
Oh, that's a great question. What we're doing is constantly demonstrating the value that when they pick up the phone and when they send that email, it really does impact funding. And that funding impacts whether they can keep their doors open or not. So by constantly keeping them engaged, and we do this a multitude of different ways. We have 50-plus webinars that we deliver annually to our members, and most of those webinars have between 200 to 500 people on. We always make that point on the webinar when we start, that we talk about how it's so important that each person is engaged. So we do that. But then also at our national conference, where we have 2,500 plus that attend, we make sure that there's airtime for this during general sessions as well, where we talk about this value, and we have a whole strand dedicated to talking about the value of advocacy. So for us, it's really just keeping it front and central, and getting members to share their success stories also has been a really, really effective tool. But I think if you're not actively communicating with your membership about why it's valuable, then they won't see the value of it. Whereas if you're constantly demonstrating that and showing them, hey, we got an additional $30 million here we wouldn't have had otherwise, that really keeps people engaged.
Right, and that's a good segue into this question, which I'll toss to you, Josh. How do you respond to a non-member who says, I don't need to join or engage because you'll do the advocacy work anyway?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like that is one of the things that you get for folks. But those type of people, when it comes to some of the basic grassroots tools, I see some organizations out there that have their grassroots database password protected. It's only for dues paying members. When it comes to those like simple things like sending a letter to a member of Congress, I want as many people that are going to tout our position as possible, whether they're paying dues or not. Once they're in there sending messages, seeing that we're engaged on these issues, we can compare members and non-members and take those email addresses, segment them out, and start pushing membership and saying, all right, you're involved, you already see, and craft these messages, very direct like this. We know that you're involved with our grassroots advocacy efforts. We sincerely appreciate it. Note that we also are involved in other areas that are pushing advocacy forward, and this is where your membership dues go. This is how we will help you. Here are some successes where we've had an impact and different tangible benefits in the public policy arena where we've achieved success. I don't like those barriers when it comes to the numbers. I know that some people, utilize those, but that's never been something that I've wanted to do because it's one of those things where you're not going to catch a fish if you don't have bait out on a hook. That's the best analogy that I can give for that.
Right, and if you've got if you've got somebody's contact details, you can market to them and eventually kind of get them into a funnel where they will hopefully become a member. So I think we've time for one more, and we're getting a couple of questions about members who may have specific issues that you can't reach, right? So there's a good example here from somebody who says, we are a local builders association. We represent builders, remodelers, and suppliers. We have large national builders and small local builders, as well as remodelers, small remodelers. Our small member remodelers do not see the value of advocacy as the builders have many more building code restrictions than the remodelers. However, we tell them, or we sell them, that general support of our industry is important, even if specific laws do not apply to them. And I think that's kind of an interesting one for sort of broader associations or any organization who maybe cover a lot of issues but can't get to, the 5% issues or the 10% issues in a year. I mean, how do you scoop all of those people up and, show them the value, even if their issue isn't one you're particularly working on? And maybe,
I was going to say, here's how I would approach it. Number one, I would always try to find a common issue that everybody agrees on because it makes it a lot easier than having lots of different people at different verticals having different opinions on things. But secondly, our job is to support our members, and sometimes you can do things to help people without sacrificing your reputation, or they'll feel like you're helping them without using all of the strength of the organization put on their behalf. Thirdly, let me just react to that free rider problem. Economists always talk about free riders. People don't want to join. You know what? You're going to have that all the time. People don't want to join. One of the non-ways I overcame that years ago, and I think this is going to ultimately come to the association, even the nonprofit community, is a money-back guarantee. I was at about 86% of beer wholesalers who were members, and it was really hard getting the last few to say, I'll join, I'll pay the money. And then I figured out one day I just called them up and said, okay, you join, money-back guarantee. You don't like what we're doing, 1 year, you call me back, I give you all your money back. So all you're losing is interest on the float. And we got to 98% of all beer wholesalers to be members, and no one ever called back for their money back. Because they then, as Josh talked about, and as Shannon talked about, they found out what occurred, and they liked it, and they became part of the solution.
Okay, great. Sharon, had you something you wanted to add in there?
Oh, I was just agreeing that demonstrating the value is so important, and I can definitely see how after that's been demonstrated, of course, nobody's going to call and ask for their money back, right? Because they see it. They see the value of being your member and what you're able to do for them through advocacy. So I was just agreeing that I think that's a great strategy.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again to all three of our panelists, David Rehr, Josh Habursky, and Sharon Bonet. We are delighted that you could be on the line with us today. Some great insights, obviously. Thanks again, everybody, for listening, and have a great day, everyone.